Dude, we are going to energise the country.
Stop Brexit.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Judith Bunting, who is a television producer and former member of the European Parliament for South East England. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
So the first question that I'd like to ask is, what first made you want to be involved in active politics, standing for election? In particular, what made you want to be a candidate for the Liberal Democrats?
I was a very, very late starter. And a number of people were very surprised when I got involved in politics. In fact, when I bumped into an old BBC friend at the rail station in Newbury some years later, she said, I would have been less surprised if you told me you were a lesbian. Basically, I'd been at the BBC. I didn't have political views that I voiced very much. I'm a science journalist, so I was interested in finding out what the facts were and less bothered by politics at all. And then we had the crash, and then I just found myself being angry. So it's about 2010, coming up to 2008, 9, 10. And I paid more attention and I got angry. And a bit of advice for youngsters, a piece of advice I was given as a youngster was work with the smartest boy in the room. And I thought, well, if this politics is getting under my skin, then who is the smartest boy in the room as far as I have access to? And I happen to live in Twickenham, and Vince Cable was my MP. I've voted for Vince for years. Took me a long while to work out what on earth a Liberal Democrat was, and I can come on to that later if you want to. But I realised that that's what I was. They believe what I believe. So I went and just started joining and helping. I delivered leaflets. I helped at the little local fete, and just got drawn in. And the Lib Dems, certainly, once you get anywhere close to them, if you're showing an active interest, then they don't let you go very far. And before I knew it, I was helping. I acted as driver in the Feltham by-election for Roger Crouch, who was a great candidate, but we never stood any chance of coming in anywhere more than third in that election. But he needed an aide and a driver. So basically I drove him round and fed him bananas. But it was the first time I knocked on doors. And it was absolutely seminal, because I realised that we were talking to people who were as politically ignorant as I had been for most of my life. I tell you, most people don't know who their councillor is. Most people do not know what ward they live in. And all of us, me too now, working in politics and being interested in politics, we live in this delusional world where we think everybody cares about politics all the while, and honestly, people don't. But the doors we were knocking on, people had needs and had concerns and had problems, and nobody was helping them. And some of the issue was that they couldn't articulate their problem very clearly. And they didn't know which services to go to. They didn't know what questions to ask. And we all have moments like that. But I just remember standing on one doorstep thinking, it doesn't matter whether I'm politically ignorant, which was my fear at this point. I can communicate. I can talk to people. I have had a career asking questions. I know how to research. I can actually help people. I could be useful here. So I decided to be a candidate. And moved out to Newbury because I could commute from Newbury to London, and it's a lovely place. And my husband had been born there, so I didn't know it ever so well, but I knew it a bit, and I liked it. I stayed in Newbury. I stood for 2 elections and was there for 8 years or so. It was lovely.
You mentioned standing in Newbury in 2015 and 2017. How different was that in terms of campaigning to when you were standing as the Liberal Democrats MEP candidate for the South East in 2019?
Oh, that's a really good question, because it completely highlights the difference between the two electoral systems. So as the candidate in a Westminster election, when you're a new candidate, for sure, your biggest issue is name recognition. So even if people, I was in a place where David Rendell had been a very, very good Lib Dem MEP for years. So although it was Tory at the time I moved there, people knew what a successful Liberal Democrat representation could be. So they weren't totally anti. But they didn't know me. They didn't know my name. So you are working madly on name recognition, You're working madly on name recognition, on making sure they understand who you are and what you stand for. It's very personal focused for 50% of the time, and the rest of the time it's party messages. When you're standing or when you're working with the European group, the reason that I put myself forward for Europe was not to get elected. And I know people think I'm just being, modest, but I'm not. I expected to end up number 5 or 6 on the list. The reason I did it was that I thought Anthony Hook should get elected as our number 2. We were pretty confident we'd get Catherine Bearder in again. And in the European elections in 2014, in Newbury, we had a hustings, and there are lots of hustings. The southeast of England is a big place, so the top candidates had to spread themselves really thinly, and we'd ended up with a guy in our hustings who was number 5 or 6 on the Lib Dem list. And lovely guy, but he was absolutely hopeless. And I nearly voted Green at the end of that hustings, because our guy did not put up a good fight. So I thought, again, I know how to talk, so I will stand. I'll get on the list, and if I'm number 5 or 6, I can still go out and do a respectable hustings. And what happened was I ended up number 3 on the list. And to go back to your question about what's the difference in the campaigning had absolutely nothing to do with who I was. In fact, I acted as a political organiser for the campaign. I didn't knock on a single door. I dropped off and delivered bundles of leaflets to people to deliver. I was the person, I ran the campaign in Newbury and West Berkshire, but with a couple of friends, we just made sure that we got as much literature out as possible, but it's all party. It's all about your principles and your vision, and you as an individual don't matter. Maybe Catherine Bearder matters because people have heard of her, and having been elected, maybe I would matter more if we were fortunate enough to be going through European elections again. But as a first timer, you can't communicate your identity and your beliefs to the whole of the southeast of England. It's completely unrealistic. So it's just a totally different campaign, totally different campaigning strategy. And it's all comes back to the joy of proportional representation.
You mentioned, obviously, the different voting systems, but also, as well, one of the differences between the European Union and the British Parliament is the structure of the European Union, with the way that the Parliament and the Council are structured. Was that something at all when you were elected and did go to the European Parliament? Was that something that was at all confusing, or did it seem natural in the way that it was structured? The business about the Council of Europe and the European Council, and one of them is EU and one of them isn't, and I'm really sorry, I'm 2-3 months out of practice now and I forget which one's which. But there's the group of the leaders, and we never have anything to do with them. They meet and they argue and they agree things, and then I suppose that filters down and helps direct the way the Commission operates. But they have nothing to do with us. The Council of Ministers I found very confusing at first. Again, we don't have much to do with them directly, but I had a much clearer idea of what the Council of Ministers could do.
But it kept on, it just never quite made sense that, because different people always seem to be representing England on the Council of Ministers, Britain rather, UK, on the Council of Ministers. And it wasn't until after I arrived in Brussels that I understood that the Council of Ministers varies, the makeup of it varies depending on what subject is under question. So if you've got a discussion of transport, then it's the ministers of transport from all the member states who get together to talk transport. If it's an energy issue, then the ministers for energy, the secretaries of state for energy from all of the member states get together and talk about stuff. And suddenly, once I understood that, things fell into place. Because, way back, like 2010, no, after 2010, end of 2010, I went to a fundraising do where Ed Davey was. And it was just, sausages in front of a fire and hear what our Secretary of State for Energy's got to say. And he was so nice, but he also was talking about how, as Secretary of State for Energy, he had the privilege of going to Europe and working with other energy ministers. And he didn't wait for anybody to change the laws or to have the Commission do something. He just found the energy ministers who were like-minded, and he talked to them about renewable energies and how they could all work together to improve things. And that is how they managed to, that sort of kick-started the move of renewable energy across Europe, but particularly in Britain, such that by the time we got to 2015, campaign line coming out now, but he had doubled the investment and tripled the generation of wind-powered energy. He did amazing things. We got to about 5% of the UK's energy being produced by renewable resources. This is back in 2015. I mean, I think it's better than that now. I haven't checked. But I never understood how he could do that. And that's being part of the Council of Ministers. And then you have the Commission, and then you have us, the Parliament. And sometimes, the Parliament is an extraordinary place, and it operates in a completely different way to Westminster, which I think is just the way that the world should be run. Go on, ask me about that, because it is just the most constructive way I can imagine any government ever working, and it gets the best out of everybody.
Well, do you think that the way that it is run is something that we should copy in Britain? Do you think it's something that we would be able to copy in Britain in terms of our parliament?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think it would come down to the national temperament. But if you look at Westminster, you have a government, and they govern, and everybody else is what's respectfully known as a backbencher, which is to say somebody who represents their part of the country, which is a good thing. We want our representatives there, but they're not involved in decision making. So you get the to and fro, the back and forth, the oppositional, confrontational politics that we know, because they're not invested in it, not invested in government. So even if it's something relatively non-political, like science policy or, health policy is increasingly political, isn't it? But even if it's something where people broadly could agree on what is the right thing to do, because 2/3 of the chamber, half the chamber, is simply not involved in getting anywhere close to policy making, they can throw stones at it. And because it's oppositional politics, they will throw stones at it. It's guaranteed. Whereas in Europe, so we sit in that huge chamber, and I had the joy of sitting directly opposite the president. So talk about being a centre party. I was about as centre as you could get. I mean, that's just the joy of an accident of alphabetical order within your group, but I still quite liked it. So if you looked at, obviously, I don't know whether people do know this, as the Liberal Democrats, we are part of the Liberal group that operates across Europe. And these groups basically bring the different parties from the different member states together to make things manageable. So there is Renew Europe was our group, and that is essentially an association of liberal democratic groups across Europe. And then you have the socialists, you have the centre conservatives, you have the right conservatives, and then you have the fascists off on the right, and then you go from on the left, and this is all from the president's perspective. On the left, you've got the socialists, and then the Greens, and then the very, very lefty Greens. And every time we took a vote, it isn't just about the voting, it's about the whole policy making. But when there is a policy up for voting, we all get a vote. If you want your policy to pass, then you have to make sure that enough people in other parties are on side, because everybody's vote matters. There is no quote unquote government. It is Parliament there making policy and voting en masse. So sometimes as centrists, we'd be supporting we always supported green policies. We didn't support the more extreme ones, but we supported green policies. We supported, I'd say, about 50% of the Social Democrat policies and amendments that went forward. Probably, 30 to 40% of the centre-right ones, the EPP, and then it fades off. So ECR, we rarely agreed with them, and if you knew that the far-right people had gone anywhere near a policy or amendment, you didn't touch it. Because even if the words looked okay on paper, there'd be a bomb hidden in there somewhere, and that's a metaphorical bomb. I'm not trying to be provocative. So we never supported anything put forward by a Hungarian fascist. You don't want to encourage them. But what all of this means is that in the course of policy making, everybody's invested. It doesn't mean they all agree, but everybody's invested. So one person, one party will lead, but everybody has a chance to put amendments forward. Everybody has a chance to discuss it. And then everybody has a vote that either puts it in or out of operation, which is quite similar to Westminster. But because everybody has had the opportunity to take part in it, you don't get the extreme oppositional politics, and it's very, very satisfying and constructive.
Do you think that part of the issue with the way that the European Union and the elements to it, the Parliament and the Commission and the councils, do you think that part of the problem with the way that this has been debated in the UK is that it hasn't been perhaps fully relayed to the British public how exactly the different parts of the European Union work, and that is why we've seen Brexit?
I think one of the reasons that I would castigate the media for not covering Europe as standard bread and butter news for years and years, like for the past 30, 40 years that we've been there. The main problem with Brexit is that people were uninformed. And I'm not being patronising when I say people, I was uninformed. And it took standing for Parliament and getting elected for me to really understand it. And that's terrible. I mean, one of the... I was involved in legislation right at the very end. On the final day I was there, I was still taking amendments to a piece of legislation. And we can come back, ask me about that later. But it was relating to the European Institute of Technology and setting their strategy for the next 7 years. I was a science journalist for more years than I care to say in public. I had never heard of the European Institute of Technology. Now, you can say that that's, I was obviously a bad journalist because I never looked for them, but I didn't know they were there to be looked for. So there's something wrong. Europe doesn't publicise itself very well, I don't think. And the media on the whole, I wasn't a political journalist, so I do cut myself a little bit of slack there. But the media just did nobody any favours by simply never talking about it, other than the joyous Boris Johnson, who made a joke of it all. And the other problem is that because it's not oppositional, there's very rarely any news, headline grabbing, visceral news. What there is a lot of quite interesting, quite important stuff, which is never going to be on the front page. So but it still should have been. Europe and our place in Europe should have been on the, I know, third page, fourth page, fifth page, of all newspapers for years and years and years. And then we could have gotten into the soap opera, if you like, so that people recognize names, in the way that now, but again, I am so in the political bubble now, it's hard to keep perspective, but people have heard of Michel Barnier, people have heard of Guy Verhofstadt, and they have become names that it's worth the newspaper writing about because people recognise them. But as I say, people, I don't know, how big's the bubble of people who would know that. They are both very impressive characters, by the way.
You mentioned the piece of legislation you were working on the last day, and I just wondered, was that something that perhaps seemed a bit odd to be working on a piece of legislation as Britain was formally leaving the European Union, and there was, of course, on that day, a lot of headline grabbing from Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party and how they acted on that day. Do you think that sort of like demonstrates the weird way that we look at the European Union and the way that it operates?
Well, the mere fact that you're talking about Farage and headline grabbing, I don't know what he did until the evening. During the day, there was Auld Lang Syne was sung in the Parliament, and I have to say that was a movement of good feeling from our colleagues on all sides. But the other reason, and I think I can say this sort of thing in public now, but it was also designed so that everybody stood up, so that if Farage and co started to stand up to try and wave flags or something, nobody would see them, because the rest of the 700-odd strong Parliament would be standing up and singing. So people were aware that he was going to be trying for things like that. But isn't it sad? Forgive me, I'm not criticising you, but just the situation that even someone politically interested like you remembers Farage, doesn't remember that all of Europe, left, right, green, centre, all stood up and sung Auld Lang Syne because they didn't want us to be leaving. And we all stood up, and the Conservatives stood up, and we stood up, and the Lib Dems stood up, and the Labour MEP stood up, the Green MEP stood up. We didn't want to leave. But that doesn't get reported because that's not man bites dog, is it? Farage did manage a David and Goliath status, and people go for that, which is a great shame.
Do you think that you mentioned the sort of like the David and Goliath status? Do you think that that's part of the reason that we didn't see a second referendum? That the way that it was, the first referendum was painted, was that if there had been a second referendum, it would have been the establishment stamping on the voters, on the quote-unquote little man?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I did a hustings at the Isle of Wight, and it was very lively. And we had people in, it was the first hustings that I did in the Euro campaign, and the Brexit Party was still coming out to do hustings. I mean, it was the only time I ever saw the Brexit Party coming out to do hustings. If you remember, they're not a political party, they're a business, so you couldn't be a member, you had to be a client, and they would, it was very odd the way that they were painted. Anyway, the upshot was they hadn't got a manifesto and they hadn't got a full set of policies. But they came out, took part in this hustings. Half of the people in the room, easily, and this is a small theatre, so half the people in the theatre were pro-Brexit and half were anti-Brexit. And the audience spent as much time shouting at each other as they did at us, which was great. I mean, it was a lively, healthy debate. I got approval from both sides when I went through my reasoning for why we should have a second referendum, because I felt that none of us had understood properly what the vote was about. And although there's still a fair chance that many of us didn't understand what the vote was about, we were all, for how many years? 3 years, better informed. And therefore, we stood a better chance of our vote reflecting our honest views. And I said then, there and then, if this goes against me, I will shut up and stop campaigning. I will totally accept it. We make it a legal referendum because, of course, the first one wasn't. And people didn't harp on about it, but the first one wasn't a legal referendum. It was only advisory. And that is because the nature of Brexit hadn't been defined. And that was another big thing that came through as the campaigns developed and led up to the Euro elections, is that we realised there were so many different kinds of Brexit and ways that Brexit could go. So what we needed was for the government to pick one, define it legally, just the side of A4. I mean, obviously there's a bigger document. Give us a side of A4 that we can all read it and understand what you have in mind when you ask us to take this vote. And then we can all vote on it. And I got approval from the Brexiteers as well, because although they wanted out, some of them wanted a customs union, some didn't want a customs union, some wanted a hard Brexit, some wanted a soft Brexit. There were all the different infinite varieties of Brexit. And I still think that would have been better for the country. If they'd done that, then it's like Remainers like me would have nowhere to go. Whereas at the moment, there's still a feeling that, okay, Boris got a clear majority. But we know on the doorstep that people were voting Corbyn Johnson. They were not voting Europe, not Europe. So we're being taken out, but I don't think it reflects the views of the majority of British people.
You mentioned the Corbyn Johnson part of the last election. Do you think that the leadership of Keir Starmer will change that dynamic at the next election? Do you think that Europe will be as much of an issue at the next election?
I suspect it won't be at the next election. I mean, the truth is that, and I've said this at Remain meetings, there's no point saying we need to be back in Europe yet. We all know that we want to be there, but let's let a few years go down the line. Part of that is because Europe has been heavily stressed by this, and frankly, they've had enough. And if we just go back and start trying to campaign again to go in, I think they'd laugh, frankly, and that's even our friends. The other thing is we'll never get as good a deal again. So you would have to look carefully at what was possible. That means that it's unlikely to raise its head again as a big electoral issue in the next, well, it depends, if the Johnson government fails next year and we have another general election, who knows, maybe. But, that's a little bit extreme. If we look at 5 years down the line, 4 years down the line, then it won't be a big deal. But as for Keir Starmer changing the nature of debate, I have high hopes. And I have high hopes because I don't know if you remember, he was the Director of Public Prosecutions. Mm-hmm. That was his last job before he joined politics. And although I'm not political, or I hadn't been involved in politics, I always listened to the Today programme. And every so often, this guy would turn up and he would make sense. And he would be in just, on crime discussions and antisocial behaviour discussions. And he always made sense. And to the extent that I made a point of making sure I listened and remembered his name. And then when he stood down as DPP, to be honest, I was on email to our head office straight away going, who's going to go round and talk to him? We have to get this man. He makes sense. He's thoughtful. He considers things carefully, and then he comes out with something which just feels right. Anyway, he's now their leader, and I'm not a Labour Party member, but I am watching this space with great interest because so far he's been very canny in the way he's put his cabinet together. He's kept in some, he's got some Blairites in there, he's got some Corbynites in there. He's got some people who haven't been involved before in there. And I think we stand a fair chance that he might actually bring the Labour Party into what I would call sensible ground again.
You talk about him bringing the Labour Party to a sensible ground. And people have suggested that perhaps at the next election, Keir Starmer might make some sort of pact or may work more closely with the Liberal Democrats than previous leaders of the Labour Party. Would that be something that you'd be in favour of?
That's a really tricky one. And, right, I'm out of politics and I'm not expecting to stand again. So I think, again, am I allowed to say these things? Basically, if you look at where the Lib Dems are in second place, and we are in second place in so many places now, and we're within a couple of thousand votes in I can't remember the numbers, but far more seats than we ever used to be. But a number of them are places like Woking and indeed Newbury, where the Labour Party are nowhere. It's Tories versus Lib Dems. And that means you have to have a lot of soft Conservatives voting for you. You need a lot of solid Liberal Democrats. You need a lot of soft Labour members voting for you. But that's the only way that Lib Dems win, is bringing people over from other parties. And if we actually made a formal pact with Labour, I think it would be death. So for all my respect for Keir Starmer, I think that would be a very bad strategic idea. Working more closely, that doesn't seem unreasonable. And if you think about how Paddy Ashdown and Tony Blair, they got on well, and they could discuss strategies and ideas and so on. Admittedly, Tony Blair rather let us down once he got into government. But it was still, I see more of a relationship like that if we have, say, Ed Davey and Keir Starmer, who can talk together as reasonable people, rather than having oppositional politics all the while.
Now, you've mentioned throughout the podcast that you have previously worked as a science journalist and as a producer of science programmes. And of course, science has very much been at the forefront of politics at the moment recently because of the coronavirus pandemic. How well do you think the government have been handling this pandemic, and how well do you think they've been presenting the science related to the disease?
I was very interested to see the presentation last week where they defined R. And I thought that was quite ambitious, not because it's that complicated, but to take the time and trouble to speak to our population like we're adults. I like that. I respected that. And I think it will help them in the long run. I should also say I cut the government a lot of slack because this is an utterly unprecedented situation. And if you look at all the data, I don't know if you use the Worldometer website, but it gives you all the data from countries all around the world. Obviously, it depends on how good the reporting is. But Sweden hasn't had a lockdown at all, and they're sort of doing okay. I look at deaths per million. I don't look at total deaths. But deaths per million the worst in Europe isn't UK, it's Belgium. Far and away. Deaths per million in Belgium is at least a couple of hundred higher than in even Spain. Spain, then Italy, and then it's the UK. It would have been good to have us down with Germany, but that's impossible because we didn't have the tests or the testing facilities or the access to testing that they had. They have Roche. Roche is the sort of are the testing gurus, and they're on German soil, ready to go. So that really, frankly, it's a good reason for not winding down our manufacturing and research facilities. Maybe we should build them up again in the future. So I don't think what our government did was perfect. We were a few days later than most of Europe in bringing in, we were certainly one of the last countries to bring in a lockdown. I think it was us and Denmark were the last in Europe. What that means, though, is that we were 3 days later than some people, maybe 5 days later than another country. This is weeks. Now, a lot can happen in 5 days. If you've got an R of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3, or 2 or 3, I suppose, then a lot can happen in 2 or 3 days. But equally, they had to look at whether the UK people, the British people, would frankly behave. And I think if they'd tried to bring it in any earlier, they would have had more trouble with people objecting to being pushed around. Now, I will cut that some slack. What I won't or don't want to be sympathetic to at all is the right-wing business people behind the scenes pushing to end lockdown early. Now, we can probably phase lockdown out safely soon, but it's going to have to be very, very gentle. I mean, yesterday they said we've got R down to 0.5 to 0.9. Well, hey, that's not very, very informative, is it? I mean, 0.6 is a hell of a lot different to 0.9. So in some ways, that told us everything and nothing. And as a journalist, I've sat in press conferences. I remember, years ago now, when I was very new on the job, I went to a press conference with Shell about the Brent Spa. Do you remember? It was an oil platform that was going to be dismantled. And we were given all the information, everything we could possibly want. But I mean, we were given all of the information. And anything you wanted to know was buried among mountains and mountains of information. So I would say beware of transparency, because it can just mean that if they don't want you to know something, you'll never know it. What we need is people who are willing to share their ideas and their reasoning because they understand it's the right thing to do. One of the things that concerns me most at the moment is that they are refusing to publish minutes from the scientific advisory groups meetings. And this isn't opposition politicians objecting to this. This is the editor of The Lancet and doctors across the UK saying, we don't know who is giving advice, and we don't know what advice is being given. And now the government's own advisory notes and advice for meetings like this is that the identity of people can be kept anonymous, because you don't want laymen, if you like, getting political flack because the other side don't like their views. However, they should be publishing minutes, and minutes should be published as soon as possible. And at the moment, the promise is that the minutes will be published after the pandemic is over. And that worries me. That's lack of transparency with knobs on. And that means that you could have the possibility where people are taking decisions that are counter to advice, and we would never know it.
We're coming to the end of the podcast. It's been great to speak to you, Judith. And I've got one final question. We're recording this on VE Day. It's the 75th anniversary of VE Day. And I just wondered, what does that as a moment in history, or what does today mean to you?
I don't want to say wept, but I had a serious tear in my eye this morning when they were playing Churchill's speech from VE Day, because I thought what he did after that was to sit down with European leaders and talk about working together so that nothing like this could ever happen again. And that's what we did, and that was the basis of the European Union. And now we're walking away. And I think that's cripplingly sad.
I think that's a sentiment that a great many of our listeners will agree with. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. Don't forget that you can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, or YouTube. You can follow us at Debated Podcast on Twitter, like us, Debated Podcast on Facebook. And if you want to email us, either about appearing or making a comment or reaction to the episode you've heard or any other episodes, then email us thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.